You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Robert del Rosario, Director of Service Development for AC Transit in Oakland, California. Robert talks about agency coordination during the pandemic, what's needed to get riders coming back, and what sustainable revenue might look like going forward. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Railvolution and appeared first on the Railvolution podcast. You can find the Railvolution podcast on your podcatcher of choice. The 2021 Railvolution Transit and Community Development Virtual Conference is coming up October 19th to 21st. Registration is now open, and podcast listeners get a 10% discount. Use code TalkingHeadways21 when you register. Again, the code is TalkingHeadways and the number 21, no spaces. Use the code and join the conversation at Railvolution coming up this October. Find out more at railvolution.org/conference. That's railvolution.org/conference. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting each month. And if you are a Patreon supporter, we just posted bonus materials with Laura Schul of Streetlight Data at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've started doing more bonus materials that enhance the initial episode, so check them out if you're a supporter. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and wish to join our merry band of transportation nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get our bus-only scarf. Appreciate everyone that has supported and continues to support the show. What would it take for our transportation infrastructure to support the well-being of all residents, not to mention the planet? We'd have to shift the system, the whole system, to sustainable, equitable, shared mobility. Join over 80 diverse thought leaders in having these important conversations at the virtual 2021 National Shared Mobility Summit, hosted by the Shared Use Mobility Center this July. Register now at summit.sharedusemobilitycenter.org. Use code BIGSHIFT21 and save 25% off. Sessions are held individually across the month, so you can still go out and enjoy your summer. That's summit.sharedusemobilitycenter.org. Well, Robert del Rosario, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Great, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, my name is Robert del Rosario. I'm Director of Service Development and Planning for the Alameda Contra Costa Transit District, also known as AC Transit. We're located in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area, cover a pretty large service area from City of Richmond to the north and City of Fremont to the south. Our main city or largest city in our area is the city of Oakland, but we also serve Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and a number of other cities in between. I attended UC Berkeley in architecture and planning, interned at AC Transit, became a transportation planner, and worked my way up to director level where I am today.
Now, how did you get into transit? Like, what was your first kind of introduction? Was it when you were a kid? Was it when you were in school? When was it, and how did that affect where you wanted to go?
Yeah, a couple of things about that. I grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is a pretty urban environment. It's not unlike Oakland in terms of diversity and density, and it's the city across the Hudson Bay from New York City. So very rich in public transit. So I do have fond memories of taking the bus to many parts of Jersey City, taking the PATH train to New York City, and taking transit quite regularly as a child. Fast forward to my years at Cal, I started realizing that planning had more interest in me and more benefits, being biased, of course, than architecture. Started taking some planning courses, worked on street furniture as a project at Cal, and had to interview folks at AC Transit, staff that are there today, actually. And they brought me on as an intern. And I really had a lot of interest, first at street furniture and amenities for public transit, the bus stop amenities, but also started getting into the service itself and service performance, and really starting to look at data, which was such a new thing when I joined AC Transit, big data, but being able to analyze that and make some conclusions from there. And so it just took off from the internship into really embracing transit as a profession, but also knowing that it's a good means of benefiting the environment.
How long did it take you to go from intern to a director?
Yeah, it's good. I started as an intern, I believe, in 97. Then I went to private sector for, I believe, a couple of years doing transit planning consulting. And then I became director in 2012 until today.
Nice. Well, we're excited to have you. So for folks that might not be familiar, where does AC Transit sit in the Bay Area's transportation universe?
Yeah, we're in the East Bay of the region. The region of the San Francisco Bay has a bay in the middle. There are some large transit agencies that serve the Bay Area, Muni and BART. There's 7 large agencies altogether. AC Transit is one of those 7 large agencies. I believe we're the 3rd highest in terms of ridership in the Bay Area, and we cover all of that East Bay geography. We are bus only. I believe we're the largest bus only transit agency in California. So many others have taken on other modes. But we provide local services, supplementary school services, and then prior to the pandemic, our Transbay service was quite popular, going to the Salesforce Transit Center in downtown San Francisco.
Well, that was the next question I was going to ask you is what was life like before the pandemic in terms of the service patterns that AC Transit provided for folks?
It was quite interesting. I think AC Transit, unlike many other large transit agencies in the country, was suffering from some slight decreases in ridership, say if you look at the last decade. And then we ticked up a little bit right before the pandemic. And, there's lots of reasons for why ridership struggled to increase dramatically, whether it's rideshare or car ownership or people moving to areas that aren't transit friendly, all of those reasons that you hear in other regions of the country. But our Transbay ridership was extremely popular, seeing record high ridership numbers. It was complementary to BART's service. And as BART was overcrowded, AC Transit Transbay service became really popular and also overcrowded. But yet as a whole, we were struggling to increase ridership. And that's likely because all of our midday ridership and our weekend ridership and evening ridership was impacted by those other factors that I mentioned. But our peak ridership was actually doing quite well. So despite putting more resources into our service, our overall ridership was unable to grow as much as, say, our peak ridership did.
And that's kind of an interesting thought experiment with the pandemic, thinking about before the pandemic, after the pandemic, the difference in work from home, what it might be. We don't really know. And I've said this on shows many times. I feel like I really don't know, so I can't say what life after the pandemic is going to be like. But we can do an interesting thought experiment of what it means to reduce that kind of peak hour travel from workers and what that means for service overall. I'm curious how you all were impacted by the pandemic and what kind of some of the internal thought experiments have been about what's going to happen afterwards.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the impact to the pandemic was quite significant for us. We saw a drop initially of, I think, 75% of our ridership. But that Transbay service, the express bus service to San Francisco that I was talking about earlier, that dropped 96%. So basically, everyone just stopped riding Transbay service. And so what we really started to focus on was knowing that people were working from home. What are the trips that we do need to serve? And what is the service that we have to put out there? AC Transit in our service area, we do have a large disadvantaged population, low-income population, minority population that really rely on public transit to get around. And it shows in our ridership. So though we had a real significant drop in our ridership in the region, I think we're only number 2 to Muni, the San Francisco transit system, in terms of daily ridership during the pandemic. So people really relied on AC Transit. And that's going to be important going forward in thinking about what transit's role is going to be in recovery and also in the long term. I don't have any doubts that express bus ridership will come back. And I think if you think about the mode share of people who take transit in the Bay Area as a commute service, it's pretty small. And the traffic's coming back on the highways. And so there are people that need to take transit. And I think we just have to do a better job of marketing to the right people to have them take the bus and really relieve traffic congestion, reduce greenhouse gases, all the things that transit needs to do. I think we can still do, but we just have to try harder at it. In the short term of recovery, I think we are in a little bit of a chicken and egg situation here, where do we put out, say, express bus service and hope that people ride, knowing that we have limited resources and we want to make sure that we're providing as much local service as possible. We know that people are riding. So we're going to have to look at that very closely, look at the patterns of people starting to commute back to their jobs, whether it's in San Francisco or other parts of our area. And take a look at that data, probably traffic data, and see if there's a market there for us to start rapidly increasing our express bus service. But again, scarcity of resources, we're going to have to look at that, along with making sure that we're serving essential trips, local trips. Kids are going to return to school in the fall. So there's a lot of things that we have to balance. And I think with the scarcity of resources, we're going to need to make sure that we're using our resources in the most efficient way possible.
And I think other agencies are grappling with that too, or even states. I mean, Massachusetts, for example, is in the news at least for having that argument about whether, we put service out now or wait to put it out later. And there are some congressional representatives that were like, we got you all this money for the pandemic. You need to use it now rather than waiting 2 or 3 years. But I mean, it is a balancing act, right? About figuring out what you can do now and how you can kind of use the resources best the way you can.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other thing to add to that is all transit agencies are getting relief dollars from the federal government, but we have to actually figure out how to spend those dollars. And that's an effort. We were lucky at AC Transit that we didn't have to lay off any bus operators during the pandemic, but we did lose bus operators to retirement, attrition, leaving AC Transit. Now we have to get those operators back. And that's not only us, that's Muni, that's Golden Gate Transit, that's every other bus operator in the region. And I think this is also going on in other regions in the country. And so we have to try really hard to get people to be attracted to taking these jobs as transit operators, and that'll help us grow. And so what we're going to do is we have the ability to at least bring back the service that we suspended. And we'll do that incrementally as we get more resources. And we're going to be judicious about which services we want to bring back, the ones that we know can carry the most riders, the ones going through disadvantaged communities. And then hopefully in a year's time, we can then reassess everything and then build a brand new network and roll that out, sort of reimagining our transit network post-pandemic.
Has the pandemic made it, I don't want to say easier, that's not the right word, but has the pandemic made the disadvantaged communities more visible for folks that might not have seen them before? I mean, as a service planner, you knew this before. You knew the impacts that transit service has on those communities. But for everybody else, we start using these terms related to, specific workers, key workers, and essential workers. We changed our vocabulary for this. I'm wondering how that's changed kind of the perception outside and how that helps you all internally make those decisions on service.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it actually shows in the data, we were able to maintain our ridership. As I mentioned, I think we're carrying about 40% of our pre-pandemic levels. And you look at our demographics and where the routes are that are carrying the most passengers, those are our trunk routes. And those are ones that go through a variety of neighborhoods, but they also go through the neighborhoods where we know there's low car ownership, where we know that there are no other options to travel. And so that's where the service has been successful, even through the pandemic. We were able to roll out a new bus rapid transit line going through East Oakland into downtown Oakland in the summer or fall of last year. And that's our most popular route. I think part of it is that it's a new service and a new service type, but that's going through the areas where people have to get to doctor's appointments, people have to get to work. The markets that are along the corridor still have employees. And that's really what's showing through during the pandemic is ridership on these trunk lines that go through these variety of neighborhoods.
Now, another question I have is, in terms of coordination, you have to coordinate with a number of different agencies, Muni and BART. You have connections to BART stations. I'm curious if that's harder now because of the reductions in service, because if you have a train that comes every 30 minutes and you have a bus that comes every 30 minutes, when it used to be 15, the connection times are a little bit staggered even more, maybe if you miss one connection or another. Has it been harder to do those connections and to do that coordination?
Yes, it has been harder, particularly on the shoulders of the service. So nights and weekends, particularly nights. Right now, the BART system ends pretty early. So then therefore, a lot of people rely on AC transit services that are out there beyond 9 p.m. to get around. So we are coordinating with BART to make sure that our schedules can match and that when they're making changes, we're able to make changes too. I think the one positive, there's a few positives, but one of the main positives that we've gotten out of the pandemic is that better coordination and communication, not only with BART, but with other transit operators. And so we're now meeting with BART fairly regularly on what their upcoming service changes are so that we can then respond accordingly and make sure that our services match. And I feel like this is pretty unprecedented from the past, where all of the operators are now talking to each other on a very regular basis, because we all want to do is recovery correctly. And therefore, we're trying to coordinate our schedules, look at hubs and make sure that those are all well coordinated where there's multiple transit operators coming out of a station.
Why do you think it was harder to coordinate before? Obviously, a big event always kind of makes people work together a little bit better, but why do you think it was so hard before?
I think we all get caught up in our day-to-day operations as transit operators, lots and lots going on. I think all of us had our different challenges. So whether it's overcrowding or safety or how we're going to serve schools or whatever that challenge may be, we all had different challenges. But now with the pandemic, I think we all have the same challenge. And now we're all coordinated and trying to move forward on addressing that same challenge, which is trying to recover from the pandemic.
There's a task force, the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force, based on an MTC framework. I'm curious what this is and what your role specifically, AC Transit's role is as part of the group.
Yeah, the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force was created by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. It's the MPO for the San Francisco Bay Area. And AC Transit is a member of the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force. I believe there are 32 members of elected officials, stakeholders, and then transit general managers. And AC Transit is one of those members.
And what is it like when you sit down in a meeting with everybody and sit around the table? Do you all just talk about transit service? Like, is it a fun conversation? Is it, I'm curious what those sit downs are like.
It's a very public forum. So those are public meetings noticed and hosted by MTC. But the subset of that is the transit operators. I think this all prompted us to really focus on recovery and coordination during recovery. So then we do have lots of meetings with transit operators trying to coordinate on planning activities, communications. We all developed a healthy transit plan to get us through the pandemic and make sure that our transit operations were safe for the customers. So there are lots of those meetings at a staff level.
There's also a number of legislation items kind of trickling through the legislature, as there are every year, it feels like. AB 629, which looks to coordinate fares and other things in the Bay Area. It requires a pilot program for regional coordination by, I think, 2023. Is that connected to the task force or is that separate?
It is related to the task force. I think there are components and activities and outcomes of the task force that will feed into some of the language of the Assembly bill. I know there's a draft out there, and then I think there's chances for revisions as it goes through further approvals.
And what are some of the things in the draft that AC Transit is a part of? Are you all coordinating what's happening now? And how is it going to get more formalized? Do you know any of that information?
Yeah, that's all to be determined at this point. But aside from that, or maybe it's even in response to that, we are doing a lot of coordination now with all the transit operators on many different aspects. It's not just service coordination, but lots of things to better coordinate between the different operators. And we're doing that, just as the operators coming together on their own initiative.
So coordination also isn't just between, say, transit agencies themselves, but the cities too. I'm curious how you all coordinate with, say, Berkeley or Oakland or any of the other cities in your service area about your service and changes that you make during the pandemic and even afterwards.
Yeah. There's a few things that we do with the local jurisdictions. One is we had to coordinate with them as they change the function of their streets. And so you can see it in San Francisco and many areas where during the pandemic, the streets take on a different role, outdoor dining, better physical distancing. So allowing people to use part of the roadway as a pathway or for seats or for parklets. And so those have impacts on transit. The cities, for the most part, have been really good about communicating those to us and trying to figure out ways that transit isn't impacted. So whether it's finding detours or moving bus stops, we've had a pretty good communication with them during the pandemic. The one thing that we're trying to really push for as a transit operator is there's all these rightful accommodations being made for pedestrians, cyclists, diners, but what can be done in sort of that quick build, tactical urbanism frame for transit? And are there ways that during this pandemic that we come out of recovery with transit operations being smoother or better on any of these corridors? And so can we put in dedicated transit lanes, red carpet lanes on some corridors now when maybe the impact won't be so challenging? Plus you have SB 288, State Bill 288, which allows for CEQA exemptions temporarily for transit projects. And if we can take advantage of that, then we can have hopefully a quicker process to try to install and implement transit priority projects. But that does require a partnership with local jurisdictions. And many of them have been very interested in trying to work with us on that.
Have you enjoyed any of the parklets or the spaces that have been created because of the pandemic?
I've been hesitant to do outdoor dining, but I have seen some parklets out there. We actually have bus stop parklets along Solano Avenue in the city of Albany in AC Transit service area, which is kind of a cool thing. And they've been really popular during the pandemic. where not only does a local business or an adjacent business install and maintain a parklet, much like the model we see everywhere, but it's right adjacent to a bus stop. And that bus stop also receives some sort of improvement of waiting space and really makes it a pleasant place to be. So having that combination of the parklet and the bus stop together is a really cool thing that we hope to see more of as parklets now become pretty ubiquitous in the cities that we operate in.
How does that conversation happen? Does the restaurant just reach out to you all, or is it the sit between the city and the restaurant? Is it between you all and the restaurant and the city? How does that kind of coordination work?
Yeah, it can happen in a number of ways. We've been trying to publicize. We have a bus stop parklet guideline document that we released, I think it was in 2018. And we try to advertise that to the cities so that when the cities do get requests for parklets and there's a bus stop there, then they can take these guidelines into consideration. In the case of the example I was talking about in Albany, the owner of a business, it's a frozen yogurt business, was interested in putting in a parklet, but there was an AC Transit bus stop there. We had some creative minds in our planning department that said, well, we should try to incorporate the bus stop into the parklet. And then the three parties, AC Transit, the city of Albany, as well as the adjacent business, worked together to come up with an MOU and process to get that in. I think it's one of maybe the first in the country, definitely one of the first in the country, but a really cool public-private partnership and really a good use of public space, multi-use of public space.
I feel like agencies kind of going in a different direction. I feel like agencies, it's a double-edged sword for them typically, and we've seen what happened during the pandemic. You can be an agency like BART, which gets a lot of fare revenue from fares, right? 60 to 70% often, and then they get dinged because the ridership drops so much. And then you have others, agencies like AC Transit, which get different tax revenues from property taxes and others that, get dinged from legislators before that because they're not getting enough from fare revenue. Is there a balance between the two? And then when you respond to, obviously the pandemic is kind of unprecedented in its scope and how it affects agencies, but it seems like you're kind of a damned if you do and a damned if you don't kind of situation from how you get funding and fare revenue. It's something that's been frustrating me. I'm curious if it's been frustrating you and folks inside of AC Transit and even your agency colleagues around the Bay Area.
Yeah, for sure. So AC Transit, you're right. We're less reliant on fares to cover our operating budget. Pre-pandemic, I think we were somewhere around 17% of our operating budget was a result of fare box recovery. And then a lot of it was sales tax, which was definitely hit hard during the pandemic. You mentioned that we do have parcel taxes and property taxes that come in, and that's fairly unique for a transit operator in the Bay Area, at least, to get that stream of revenue coming in, which was really steady for us, which was part of the reason why we were able to not have to reduce our service as much. But it certainly is frustrating that you have certain levers of funding coming in that fluctuate so much. And it's certainly challenging. And what I'm hoping is that what we're realizing in the country is that during the pandemic, transit is an essential service that carried essential workers to their jobs and other appointments. And so does this change the conversation about transit subsidy? And will it be more steady? And will the federal government maybe play an ongoing role in funding the operations of transit? I think they've done a good job of giving capital subsidies to operators to build transit infrastructure, but the operating dollars was always a local responsibility. And I wonder if this is going to be the paradigm that changes that and shifts it to a federal responsibility, and will remain to be seen.
Does it seem like the discussion is moving more towards reframing transit as a public good or a necessity? That's my wanted outcome, obviously, but does it seem like that discussion is changing? I feel like sometimes it is, and then sometimes maybe it isn't.
I think for us to show our value as a transit operator, we have to show that we're doing that, right? That we're a public good. And I think it shows in the people that we've carried and the trips that have been taken on our services during the pandemic. So I'm cautiously optimistic that transit operators during the pandemic have been able to display that, yes, we are a public good, and people couldn't get to their jobs at the supermarket if it wasn't for public transit. It's an affordable way to get around, and it's also an efficient way. And I think we're demonstrating that as we go through the pandemic.
I'm curious also, you talked about potential federal support for operating. I'm wondering what that would look like hypothetically, or something that you would like to see come out of federal, pot of money that was for operating? Would it just be for general operations, or would it be something like my dream? And I've shared this with the audience a number of times, but my dream is that they kind of backfill some of those. If you're going to make some seamless transportation investments in the Bay Area, some of the hard part of that is the revenue that's lost from transfers between agencies. I was thinking, it'd be interesting to see if they actually, backfilled some of those transfers and paid for operating in that way to make transit more seamless. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what might be beneficial from a federal standpoint if the bill or if the federal government was to kind of hop into that pool of water that they kind of have never dipped their toes in before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think regional coordination is a good project or program for the federal government to fund. I think it's really gray as to how those funding sources would come about locally. So therefore, at a higher level, that does make a lot of sense. But I think overall, the issue is a cyclical nature of operating funding for transit operations. And you'll see it. It's evident when there's a recession, then you know that transit operators are going to have to cut service. And that's not necessarily because people are riding less. We've shown that the number of people riding transit is contingent upon the amount of service that we can put out there. So the more service we put out there, the more people are going to ride. Sounds like an obvious thing, but I think it's revealing in that if we kept the same amount of service out there and had a steady revenue stream for that, then we can retain some ridership. And so the federal government or some other funding source jumping in to keep revenue streams as steady as possible over, decades would be really important for us to maintain our service levels and then really look at increasing. Because otherwise we're in this cyclical transit planning and operations mode where we build service and then some financial recession happens and we end up having to cut service again and then build it back again. And it's really, kind of just spinning our tires as opposed to really making some good progress in the future.
That's a really good point. I mean, the stability is really important. And even before the pandemic, it was somewhat cyclical. You'd get these, like you said, recessions where you'd cut out sales tax and it'd be reduced, or gasoline prices would increase, for example, and then you'd get more ridership, but then they'd decrease again, and then you get less ridership, which means less fare revenue and then the sales tax and all that stuff. So it's all interconnected, but it would be beneficial, it feels like, to have kind of a baseline every year. It makes me think of Minnesota and their sales tax revenue sharing that they have. They have a baseline, and then based on the increases every year they share. Might be interesting to think about that. It's a kind of a more technical, maybe too technical plan. I'm always thinking this way. I need to simplify things a little bit more. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that would be nice to have some sort of a baseline, because otherwise we continue to ping pong and waffle back and forth, and that's not good for anybody.
Right. And I think, one other piece of this is where the federal government can play a big role, and they have and continue to, is maintaining our assets. So keeping these in a state of good repair is really important. It's important for bus transit agencies, even more important for rail transit agencies. And I think we're seeing that now in the country where a lot of the transit agencies are really just aging, and now it's affecting your operations. And so keeping an investment on the transit asset side is equally as important.
Yeah, and it seems like they want to make a big investment into things like electrification, and those are massive investments, especially when you think about how to replace all the buses and how to replace all of the equipment that goes into the bus yards that would be required to charge all the buses. So that's a major capital investment that they're thinking about making that would impact you all, I imagine. I mean, you all have been doing a lot of, I remember the zero emission buses driving around downtown when I worked downtown Oakland. You've had the hydrogen buses and you've done a lot of testing. So it's not something that's new to AC Transit, but it is something that big of a change would need some capital investment, I imagine.
That's right. Yeah. And it's, when you look at it from a public perspective, it seems pretty simple. Like, oh, we'll just plug in a bunch of buses into the grid and we can start operating zero emission buses tomorrow. But it's complicated. Buses are not private automobiles, and you have to have buses in service 24 hours a day. So to be able to cycle those through and charge them is really important. And then also having the right infrastructure in place, that's probably the key thing. And so whether it's charging or it's a hydrogen fuel cell fueling, you need to have infrastructure in place that doesn't exist, especially on old properties where the infrastructure, whether it's electric or anything else to power hydrogen stations, is not there. And so you have to bring that all in and retrofit your station. So it's a huge capital investment that we're really committed to at AC Transit. We have to meet, of course, the California Air Resource Board's mandates for going to a zero emission fleet. And we're really proud to look at both of these technologies, both hydrogen fuel cell and battery electric buses, and really understand what's the best technology going forward by testing them out.
Let's do a fun question. Let's forget you think about service for a transit agency all day. What frustrates you most when you try to take transit somewhere in the Bay Area?
It's a good question. I would say for the vast majority of the Bay Area, the density isn't there to lend itself to good and easy transit riding. And I kind of live in an area where it's in between. I live in Albany in the East Bay, which is just above Berkeley. I'm about 3/4 of a mile to a BART station, 2 blocks away from a AC Transit route, but the bus service itself is not frequent, and the BART station is quite a distance. And so for us to be, say, fully dependent upon transit or be completely autoless in our household is a little bit difficult to do. And of course, we want better transit, but I think we also have to have the better land use and housing density to accompany that so that it does become a very easy thing to do to ride transit to all of your destinations and trips. And I think right now I can get a lot of it done, but I can't get all of it done.
Do you have a favorite line to ride in the service area? I know that's kind of a loaded question because you're going to say, I love all of my lines, because I ask this question to folks a lot and they always give these cagey answers, but I'd like to hear like what your actual like favorite line to ride is.
Yeah. So I ride a lot of the service going through Berkeley and Oakland. I remember riding the 51 regularly when I was a student at Cal. And then even when I had the internship at AC Transit, I would take the bus from campus over to downtown Oakland. And you go through so many different neighborhoods. And then you see a whole different group of populations that ride the bus as you take the trips pretty long. Most people take a transit trip on our service about 3 or 4 miles. I was taking it a lot longer. So you see a lot of people get on and off the bus. And it was great to see on the 51B that first you'll get your students, and then you'll get your seniors, and then you'll get your hospital workers, and then you'll get your downtown employees. So that was one of my favorite routes, just given all the neighborhoods that it goes through.
Yeah, I like the 51 too. I take it still even. I get off BART at 12th Street and ride it up to Kaiser instead of walking from MacArthur. I think it's just a more fun and better ride to get between those two places.
Yeah.
Is there a model of transit somewhere around the world that you think provides good ideas to use locally?
There are lots of models internationally right now on demand response service, microtransit, and those are interesting. I think if we can get the costs down here in this country to provide that service and really get the software dialed in, then that's certainly a possibility that we want to explore more. But that's one on the low end of the spectrum, I think, in terms of how much ridership we could actually generate from that. But there are some good European models. I think Helsinki is the one that really comes to mind. I think more important for us is the other end of the spectrum in how can we carry as many people as possible. And that's, systems that have lots of bus rapid transit, lots of dedicated lanes, and really pushing those types of programs and projects to really think about transit first and then really try to make that transit trip as fast and reliable as possible. I think those are the models that I like to look toward. There's definitely some in South America. I think with the explosion of BRT there in the last 20 years that really we tried to emulate here in the United States. But there are other places internationally where bus really is the workhorse for public transit. And those are BRTs, zero emission buses. So, those are the ones that we want to really emulate the most.
Do you think we'll get to a region-wide transit priority network where we have BRT and rail and all coordinated into a system that's legible and easily connected?
I think we can get there. I think it requires a lot of investment, financial investment. There have been previous attempts in the Bay Area to do that. And I think we can get there definitely on the arterials as, say, the Department of Transportation for the state starts looking at their arterials and how they can be more efficiently used. So looking at ways to get buses through the freeway network more reliably and more quickly, whether it's dedicated transit lanes, express lanes, bus on shoulder, those types of things will definitely help on the regional network. And hopefully that will trickle down into the local network, but then you're dealing with different jurisdictions. But I think if the dollars are there, then these projects can move forward. There have been some bus rapid transit projects that have just been so slow to get to implementation. There's a couple in San Francisco, of course. Our own in AC Transit took many years to get implemented. And I think once we're able to show successes, particularly here for us in AC Transit, then I hope that BRT will become more popular with the local jurisdictions. And then we can look at other corridors where we can implement that. So I think it's two levels. It's the state level and the freeway network, and then it's the local level at the local streets.
Yeah, just this last week, I think Muni announced that they were looking at HOV lanes on Lombard, I believe, which is something totally new for Caltrans, something they probably hadn't considered before. So I'm excited to see what that does and then what that allows other agencies to do in the region as well. Also, there's fun talk of maybe a bus lane on the Bay Bridge, which might be exciting for you all as well, I imagine.
Absolutely. So a couple of things there that I wanted to respond to. One, with the dedicated lane network, you mentioned Lombard. What we want to look at is it's dedicated lanes, right? It's paint on the ground, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all of this significant infrastructure to give buses priority. And so is there a way that we can roll out a network of dedicated transit lanes that our vehicles can take advantage of that doesn't take, decades to roll out, and we can look at that, within 1 or 2 years. So I'm really hoping that SFMTA can lead the way on that. They have a lot more Caltrans right of way than AC Transit, but we do have some significant streets that are state right of way where we can hopefully use SFMTA as that model. And then with the Bay Bridge, yep, that's extremely important for us. There's lots of discussion about that, and there's a bill I think just made it through a few of the committees at the state level to look at a dedicated lane on the bridge. And you have to look at everything. You have to look at the approaches to the bridge on both sides. Then you also have to look at the freeway network that leads to the approaches. So there's a lot to explore and unpack there. But the lane on the bridge itself, if you're looking at traffic right now, there's been some recent local articles about traffic coming back. And I believe it's somewhere around 85 to 90% of the traffic has returned to the Bay Bridge corridor. And if we don't get that dedicated lane now, it's going to be more and more difficult for us to get that. We only carry, we only operate, I believe it's around 100 to 120 buses per hour pre-pandemic to San Francisco. A dedicated lane can probably double that capacity. And if we can do that, then now you have a real travel time competitive way to get to San Francisco, complements BART, and really gets people out of their cars. And demonstrating that through a dedicated lane on the bridge is definitely a plus. And just imagine being stuck in your car in traffic and you see buses, zooming by at 40 miles per hour. Is really a marketing tool in itself.
That's my favorite thing. I go visit the East Bay fairly frequently with my parents and my grandmother in Lafayette. And one of my favorite things is during rush hour, going to dinner with them on BART and watching and passing on 13 as you just pass all these cars.
Yeah.
And it's the best thing ever.
Exactly.
So I can see that working. Given your coordination with all the other agencies in the region because of the pandemic, do you have any advice for other regions or other transit agencies that are looking to make transit better going forward from your experiences locally over the last year or so?
Yeah. I think a few things. We developed this healthy transit plan. And so we were very aggressive about that. And we released that early on in the pandemic. And that made a statement that says, you can ride transit and it's safe. We're putting all of the protocols necessary, whether it's PPE, physical distancing, cleaning and sanitation of the vehicles. We put that out there immediately. And so getting the trust of the public was an important thing. And I think that's going to be important going forward for all transit, is getting their trust back in riding transit. One, knowing that it's safe to ride, but two, that it's reliable. And the one thing that we're all looking at as transit operators in the Bay Area, particularly the surface transit operators, is how can we make our service more reliable? That's the number one thing that we know will get people riding transit again, is if it's reliable and if it's fast. And if we can address those two things, then people are going to come and ride transit. And so the more that we coordinate on that, especially for corridors that go, beyond jurisdiction borders, if we can coordinate on those corridors and really get transit to be a priority, then I think we're going to see some successes. And so for other transit operators out there, there's lots of discussions about fares and different aspects of transit to make it more attractive to the rider, technology, apps. Those are all very important. But I think the most important thing is fast and reliable service. And whatever we can do to get to that point, especially now when traffic hasn't fully come back yet, I think this is an opportunity for us to try to take advantage of.
Awesome. Well, Robert, I want to be mindful of your time. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.